We come only to sleep, only to dream. It is not true that we come to live on this earth. We become as spring leaves. We grow green and open the petals of our hearts. Our body is a plant in flower. It gives flowers and it dies away. Well, this was spoken by an Aztec king describing their understanding of the cycle of life and death. For Aztecs, life was the dream state, and death was the true awakening. In many Mesoamerican cultures, but we're talking about Aztecs today, death is seen as a very natural part of the cycle of life. There is birth, life, death, and birth again. And it is these centuries-old beliefs that ultimately blended with the Catholicism that the Spaniards brought over to the New World that created this unique, beautiful, and intriguing holiday that they called Day of the Dead. Dia de los Muertos in Spanish is celebrated by Mexican, Mexican-American, and Latin American families, and they gather during this time to honor and remember their deceased loved ones. So the ancient Aztecs already had festivals and ceremonies around this time of the harvest in late summer that were to honor their dead, and they gave offerings. They set out offerings of maize and flowers and things. Tamales. I found out in my research for this that tamales actually came from the Aztecs. And so they were already doing that type of a celebration. And so when the Spaniards came over, they said, well, cool, because we have a holiday around that time too. It's called the All Saints and All Souls Days. And so, you know, when you're conquering a civilization, it's easiest if you can kind of go with some of the things that they are already doing. And so this is what happened to this amazing holiday, was the All Saints and All Souls Days got superimposed onto what was already a time of festivals honoring the dead. And now we have some 500-600 years later, the modern Day of the Dead. So Mexicans typically believe that during this time, the veil that separates the living and the dead is somehow thinner, more porous, more permeable. And so they believe that during this time, the souls of their dead loved ones can return to visit them. And so they receive the dead in their homes, in the cemeteries, even in places of business. They put up altars. People typically go to the cemeteries during this time and spend a lot of loving time cleaning the graves and decorating them with flowers and food and all kinds of things. And then it's like a big picnic on the night of Day of the Dead, which is November. The Day of the Dead is November 2nd, but it's celebrated the night of November 1st. And so they have these elaborate picnics in the graveyards. But it's not a somber time. It's music and dancing and singing and eating and spending time together. Remembering the dead, but not in a somber way. Traditionally, and so just to clarify, this is changing. I lived in Mexico many years ago, but modern Mexican families, I didn't see practicing this. This is something that is more practiced in the more traditional, the more outlying, villages and pueblos and such, and especially in the areas that are highly indigenous. But I believe that this is changing because Mexican Americans have created this kind of revival of Day of the Dead that is now going back to Mexico, and so it's becoming more popular in Mexico. A few days ago, I saw on, it might have been PBS, I'm not sure what channel it was, but they were broadcasting this National Day of the Dead celebration from the Zócalo, which is the square in Mexico City. And it was hundreds and hundreds of dancers, Aztec dancers, and people dressed, with skeleton heads, and it was just crazy amazing. Now, I don't know how long that's been going on, but I think it's fairly new that it has become more popular to celebrate this holiday. And so this is an important holiday for so many reasons, but one of the reasons is because it's being adopted by Mexicans and Mexican Americans as a way of finding that pride in their culture, in the old ways and the traditions. So the traditional thing to do is to put an altar in your home, which the Spanish word is ofrenda, which really means offering. So it's a place that you set up in your home with offerings for the dead. And so they typically would place religious objects and symbols, as well as photographs, mementos, things that belong to the dead person or persons. You've got multiple people on one ofrenda. I've seen bottles of tequila, bottles of their favorite beer, plates of mole, all of their favorite things that they like to eat when they were alive, maybe even a CD of their favorite music, whatever it is that reminds you of that person and what that person loved. And then they place pan de muerto, which is a special bread that they make at this time. It's different in different regions of Mexico, but all the Mexican bakeries are full of it right now. So, actually it's the third, so it's probably starting to go away, but it's just, tons of it. And then they also use incense called copal, which we don't have because it might bother people, but that plus the marigolds, which in the Aztec word for marigold is what they still use in Mexico today, cempasúchil. And these marigolds were important to the Aztecs because they reminded them of the sun, the brightness of their color, but they have a strong scent. And so that scent was believed to help lure the dead back. And some people, if you go online, you can see people even, pull the petals off and make these long pathways leading up to their homes to help the dead find their way back. And then you place a glass of water on the altar because the dead get thirsty. Sometimes they even put a place for the dead to wash up. I just love these things. It's so fascinating to me. And so, lots of skeletons, lots of skulls, and I don't have time to go into, we learned about this last week in our class that I gave after the service about how skulls come from the Aztecs also, but now they create sugar skulls with their names on them. And some of us gathered on Friday night and we painted our own sugar skulls. And well, they were ceramic, but it was the idea. And that was a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun doing that. And so, you know how you go get a keychain with your name on it? Well, in Mexico, you go to the bakery and you get a sugar skull with your name on it. And so, all of these things that they place on the altar are believed to increase the chances that the loved ones will come and spend time with them. And some Mexicans believe that the dead even, in a sense, partake of the essence of the food and of the offerings that are placed out. So in the Aztec view of life, death is just part of the cycle. It's a circular process where death gives way to rebirth and death again. And so rather than avoiding death, Mexicans typically with this holiday face death. But as I mentioned before, it's not in a somber or macabre or bloody or violent, all the ways that we see death depicted in this culture. It's very different. Now, this is not to say that Mexicans do not mourn their dead. Of course they do. Of course they mourn their dead. Of course they cry. And they feel grief and pain, just like everyone else. But there's just a different perspective, a different way of looking at death, which comes from these ancient traditions. And so there's a playfulness, getting a skull with your name on it. It's like irony, right? It's like, we all know we're going to die, like we talked about last week, right? But we act as if we're not. We pretend as if it's not a part of life. The Mexican perspective is to face that death, to look at it, stare it down, stare it in the eyes, and then depict skeletons riding bicycles and dressed up as bride and groom and dancing and doing all kinds of things. So there's a mocking and a playfulness and a humor to it, which I think makes it more palatable. And so death is seen as a continuation of life rather than an ending. the very famous, I believe, Marianne can help me, Nobel Prize-winning author Octavio Paz. Very famous Mexican author. This is what he said about it. The word death is not pronounced in New York, in Paris, in London, because it burns the lips. The Mexican, in contrast, is familiar with death, jokes about it, caresses it, sleeps with it, celebrates it. It is one of his toys and his most steadfast love. True, there is perhaps as much fear in his attitude as in that of others, but at least death is not hidden away. He looks at its face. Every year they do this. Every year they have this entire festival that goes on for days where they remember that we're going to die. We're all going to die. And it just helps them have a better perspective on death. So in our culture, as we talked about last week, there's a lot of taboo around death. You're not supposed to talk about it. You know, when we know someone has lost a loved one, we have that discomfort, like we don't know whether to say something about it. You don't know whether if you mention it, it's going to hurt them, or if you don't mention it, it's going to hurt them, right? And sometimes we just don't know how to act. It makes us uncomfortable. And I've noticed, especially in my own family, that we don't talk about the dead as much as I wish that we would. You know, it's like maybe at Christmas we mention grandma or something, but you know, I love that there's days set aside for that remembering. It can be healthy for us to talk about death and to talk about our deceased loved ones. It can help us in our process of grieving. And it can also really help with the unresolved issues that we might have around that person's death. If someone dies and we bury them, we grieve them, and we move on, it may not be done. And I love this idea of revisiting it every year. Is there more grieving to be done? Are there unresolved issues? Are there things that I need to work out, that I need to talk about with family members, with friends, with a pastor? It also helps to keep the memories of our loved ones alive. And this can be so valuable. Some of us that gathered on Friday night watched a movie called The Book of Life, which is an animated film, but it's about Day of the Dead. And to me, the most important quote in that movie was, "As long as we remember them, they are with us. The moment we forget them, they are truly gone." And so it's that idea that we keep those memories alive by remembering our loved ones. And future generations can learn from those who maybe they even didn't know in actual life. Vicki tells that her grandsons, who were born after her husband Rory died, know all about Grandpa Rory because they do this tradition every year of putting out photographs and talking about Rory. And so then there are these grandchildren that know who their grandpa was, and they can talk about him, and his memory is kept alive. I wanted to also, of course, mention Dan Schaefer. You know, let's not forget about Dan Schaefer. Let's talk about him. Let's remember what he taught us and what he did, and you know, how he still influences us, how he comes through me sometimes and through the things that I say. So no one knows what happens when we die. It's a mystery. But one thing we can know for certain is that we are all going to die. In Unity, we don't see death as an ending. We see it as a continuation of consciousness. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but we believe that we go on in some way. And by embracing this and looking squarely at our own mortality, we can learn to live with less fear of death. As long as it's like under the bed, hidden, then it's the boogeyman, right? But if we bring it out into the light and we look at it, it can start to dispel some of that fear, because we all have some level of fear about dying. It can also help us, and we talked about this last week, to live more fully. If we go through our lives pretending like we're never going to die, we may forget how precious every single moment is. Remembering our own mortality can help us to not squander a single precious moment of our life. And so, for me, this Mexican perspective on death informs me. I'm never going to think quite like that because it's not the way I was raised, but I can look at it and I can use it to expand my own understanding, my own way of looking at death. And I hope that it helps expand your understanding of death too. It's not our culture, but it's something that we approach very respectfully because we think that there's something for us to gain from it. And so after the service, we'll be having a death cafe, which is that informal, open discussion of death. And we did it last year, and I didn't have to facilitate or anything. People had plenty to talk about because it's something that I think in some ways we are yearning to talk about. And so this congregation adopted a celebration of Day of the Dead I think it's been about 5 years now. And even though it's important that we grieve and remember our loved ones privately, there's a power in doing it communally. And I think there can be healings that happen. Because when we come and we place that photograph on the altar and we see someone else placing theirs, it's that reminder they've lost someone too. We're not alone in our grief. Everyone has lost someone. Everyone. And it helps us remember that it's a common human experience, that we are all in this together. And for me, pets are just as important to remember as people. They are part of our families. For some of us, they have a profound effect. And so it's a wonderful way to remember them as well. So we're going to begin our ceremony with a time of sharing with one another about who we are honoring, remembering, specifically or particularly this year, and what they meant to us. And we create such a safe and loving space here that I think it's just a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to share these things with one another because there's so much power in that. And so I know that this is a safe space for everyone who will share today. And I just pray that there will be healing that will happen. I'm going to start off by sharing about my